Good afternoon, everybody. Oh, let's try that again. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. There we go. We've all kind of had cabin fever here, right? So let's be excited. We're out at a national park today. All right. All get your cars dug out? Yeah. Well, we all want to welcome you here to Gettysburg National Military Park today. My name is Dan Vermilya. I'm a park ranger here at Gettysburg. It's very nice to be here with you all. Before we get started, just a couple housekeeping things regarding what we have going on with our winter programming here at the park. Tomorrow we will be having our monuments program at 11 a.m. in the Ford Education Room. And at 1:30 tomorrow afternoon, we're going to be having our winter lecture with Scott Hartwig discussing Reconstruction and Remembrance on Cemetery Ridge. The programs from last weekend that got snowed out have been rescheduled for March 19th and 20th. So put those on your calendar. Essentially, we're just moving them to those days. And we wanted to make a note that our book series is still ongoing. We wrapped up our portion covering Tony Horowitz's Confederates in the Attic this morning. I see a lot of familiar faces who are here for that session. Next week, we're going to start this book here. Gettysburg Requiem, covering the life of William C. Oates. And of course, that is in part what we will be discussing here this afternoon for our winter lecture today. I want to begin here with July 2nd of 1863. It was, at least in my opinion, the pivotal day of the Battle of Gettysburg. The fighting that day did not last all day long, lasted about 6 hours. But in those 6 hours, this battlefield saw some of the most vicious fighting in all of American history, with nearly 20,000 casualties. And of course, in the midst of that fighting, we have these two figures. Of course, at a Gettysburg program, I feel like I hardly need to tell you who this man is, but of course, that is Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. And his adversary on Little Round Top, this man not quite as well known, that is, of course, William C. Oates, the commander of the 15th Alabama Infantry. Now, that day was cataclysmic for so many lives. It was crucial for the future of this nation in so many different ways. And when we think of that day, we most often think of images such as these. Chamberlain heroically defending the left flank of the Union line on Little Round Top, ordering his famed bayonet charge towards the advancing Confederates. We might also think of this image here, the Confederates pushing uphill against the Maine soldiers after having a long march just to get to the battlefield that day. But that's not really what this program's about this afternoon. We are not going to be rehashing the fight for Little Round Top here. We are instead going to be focusing on these two men, Chamberlain and Oates, and their lives. In keeping with our theme this year, our post-war theme of Reconstruction and Remembrance of the War, we're going to take a look specifically at how Little Round Top and this fight at Gettysburg impacted the rest of their lives. What did they do after the American Civil War? Because it seems far too often we think of this as what happened on Little Round Top. And when we think of Chamberlain and Oates, this is the extent to which we think of them. We think of Jeff Daniels screaming bayonets in the movie Gettysburg. But I want to remind you that these are real people, and they were affected by this battle in real ways, and we're going to look at the rest of their lives. After all, this quote from Chamberlain says quite a bit. The whole truth is sometimes quite different in its bearings from what is called truth. But to make a part truth displace the whole is not in accordance with old-fashioned ethics. And of course, we're going to talk about Chamberlain and his memory of the war this afternoon as well. Before we get into their post-war lives, I just want to introduce you, because I know not everyone here is going to be familiar with these individuals. I want to introduce you to who they were before the American Civil War and what they did during the American Civil War. And we will start with our Southern representative here today, Mr. Oates. Born in 1835 in Pike County, Alabama, Oates had kind of an interesting upbringing. He left for Florida at the age of 17 after getting in a violent fight, so violent that he thought he killed another man, so he fled from home trying to avoid any legal trouble. He was kind of a vagabond nomad for a while, you might say, going to a couple different states, came back home to Alabama in the mid-1850s to practice law. He ended up becoming the editor of a Democratic newspaper in 1860. He's an ardent supporter of secession, and when the Civil War begins, he recruits a company that will be involved or a part of the 15th Alabama Infantry. And of course, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, the name that is highly associated with this place. Born on the opposite end of the country in Maine in 1828, oldest of 5 children. Of course, he attends Bowdoin College for a number of years. He's very well read. He can speak many different languages. He gets married in 1855. He studies at a theological seminary for a few years. He's a professor at Bowdoin for a few years. And in the summer of 1862, he enlists in the Union Army, famously getting that sabbatical to go study in Europe and then pulling a quick one and going enlisting in the Union Army. Throughout the Civil War, these 2 officers, these 2 men saw action at many different places. Chamberlain initially is the lieutenant colonel of the 20th Maine. He sees action at the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 1862. He misses out on Chancellorsville due to disease in his regiment, and of course he's famously here at Gettysburg. He will rise to the rank of brigadier general by 1864. Oates himself is involved in a lot of different fighting throughout the war. He's involved in some of the campaigning in the Shenandoah Valley under Jackson in 1862, and he's seen quite a bit of action as well, especially out in the Western Theater. After the Battle of Gettysburg, Oates is part of the contingent of the Army of Northern Virginia that is sent out to Chickamauga. I have to ask, is this mic working? It sounds like it's cutting in and out. Okay. Wonderful. I'll just try to project my voice as best I can here. All right. One thing I want to relate that they do have in common is they are each severely wounded at the Battle of Petersburg. June of 1864, Chamberlain's about ready to lead his men in an advance, and a bullet strikes him right through the hips. He was thought to be mortally wounded, got a promotion from Grant. He thought he was dying, wrote a letter home to that effect. He miraculously survived through the work of Dr. Abner Shaw, who was the surgeon of the 20th Maine. Oates himself was also severely wounded at Petersburg. He was back in the Eastern Theater at this time. He was hit in the right arm, ended up having his arm amputated. Each officer was hit 6 times during the Civil War. Each was severely wounded at Petersburg. Those wounds would impact the rest of their lives. And of course, at Appomattox, Oates was not present at Appomattox, but as we all know, Chamberlain certainly was. He accepted the surrender of many of the Confederates there on April 12th, and he ordered a salute for the surrendering Confederates. As he said, it was honor answering honor. And that would have an impact on his post-war Reconstruction political career, because here he is, a Union officer, essentially ordering a salute to Confederate soldiers who had just been engaged in fighting the Union Army for 4 years. Many Northern families lost loved ones at the hands of this Confederate army. But at the end of the war, like so many others, Chamberlain and Oates have to make a transition. They are volunteer soldiers, and now they must go from their wartime experiences fighting for the causes for which they believed with muskets to still fighting for those causes, but in a different regard, fighting for them as veterans. And here's the fascinating thing. They have a lot of similarities. They're very different guys on a lot of different levels, different temperaments, different beliefs, different upbringings, different families. They're each severely wounded at Petersburg. They're each wounded numerous times throughout the war. And after the war, they each go on to become governors of their respective states. So, of course, our program is titled today, Colonels in War, Governors in Peace. And that's part of what we're going to be talking about. But we're also going to talk about how each of these men sought fulfillment in politics. They never truly found that fulfillment. And instead, they sought to shape the memory of the war in its aftermath. Now, simply because his term as governor came first, we'll discuss Chamberlain first up here. He's governor of Maine 4 consecutive terms. No, that doesn't mean 16 years, and in fact, it means 4 years. They're 1-year terms. As a war hero, he's an obvious choice for Republicans in Maine, right? Had a lot of different options. He could have stayed in the Army. But if you're a Republican leader in the state of Maine, who better to run for governor than this guy, the hero of Little Round Top? He's elected governor in September of 1866 by the largest margin in Maine history. I think it was something like 70% of the vote that he got. And he won substantial margins in every one of his subsequent elections. Now, as governor for his 4 years in the state of Maine, he's not dealing with issues of enfranchisement, and he's not dealing with issues of Reconstruction the way that governors in the South are dealing with them. Instead, his main domestic issues are going to be dealing with things we wouldn't necessarily think of in the 1860s in Maine: prohibition and capital punishment. Maine was one of the first states to enact prohibition laws, and there was pressure on Chamberlain during his term as governor to create some sort of a special force to enforce these laws, because it was incumbent before this on local police to enforce them. And Chamberlain was pressured to create this new state force to enforce these laws. He wasn't really keen on doing that, as he thought it could lead to a violation of people's rights, so he resisted that pressure. In regards to capital punishment, Maine law stipulated that the governor would carry out death sentences. Now, many of Chamberlain's predecessors as governor had simply ignored this. They wouldn't ever schedule an execution date for many of these individuals. Chamberlain requested that the legislature either change this law so that they were actually following the letter of the law in action and in spirit. He had a lot of controversy because he actually did order the execution of several people according to their sentences. So he's dealing with a lot of domestic issues such as prohibition and capital punishment. But because of the time in which he is governor of this state, he is also dealing with larger Reconstruction issues as well. And we can see that by his first inaugural address, where he's speaking to some themes of Reconstruction, some themes of that time. He said, "We are struck with amazement and thrown upon our guard when we see those who with scorn and contumely spurned the Constitution and defied the government and sought with violence and cruelty to destroy the Union, now demanding with equal effrontery the same spirit of violence, without an apology for the past, without a guarantee for the future, and the unconditional restoration of their rights under the Constitution, their place in the Union, and their prestige in the government. War is not a game where there is everything to win and nothing to lose. Those who appeal to the law of force should not complain if its decision is held as final. The theory we have established is not that the nation is all and the states nothing. It is rather this, that on all questions involving rights and interests of all the states, we owe a paramount allegiance to the Union. In short, that the ultimate authority of the government is not the will of each state, but the people of the United States. So far as you have power, you will not permit the issues practically settled by the war to slip back into a state of doubt or question, not that this delivered country, manhood shall ever again be denied to man." Chamberlain was not a radical on the issues of Reconstruction. As we will see, he was a moderate in many ways. But as a Union veteran, he felt very strongly that the issues settled by this war should continue to be settled. Now, he would have his own thoughts on various Reconstruction amendments, specifically the 14th Amendment. During his campaign for governor, this debate over the 14th Amendment is going on throughout the country, and Chamberlain was kind of non-committal in some of his statements on it, something that was picked up by some of the papers in Maine at that time. One paper in Portland wrote, "Upon the constitutional amendment, the message is quite non-committal, leaving us in doubt whether the governor really desires the ratification of the amendment by the legislature or not." Chamberlain's hang-up on this amendment, whether to support it or not, was in the clause where essentially it said that if southern states denied the right of vote to freedmen, they would have their representation in Congress affected by that. Well, essentially this is a loophole saying that, well, these states, they'll be punished for it, but they can have their own decisions on whether or not to give the right of vote to freed blacks. So Chamberlain and other Republicans questioned whether or not this was a good thing in this amendment. Ultimately, he came around and supported it. He acknowledged that, like any amendment, it had its imperfections. So Chamberlain is governor at this time of these major debates taking place in this country over the legacy of the war and whether or not these issues settled by the war will continue to be settled. As a civilian leader, he's having to approach problems in a different way than he had as a military leader. And this is something that he himself acknowledged was a weakness, a difficulty for him. He had to approach things from different angles, different sides, and he wasn't quite used to doing that, this new style of political leadership. But he was a very strong political leader in some regards. And one instance of that had to do with the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. Congress is fighting over whether or not it's going to have control of Reconstruction. It's going to have control over presidential appointments and the Tenure of Office Act after the Civil War. Well, Johnson tried to have his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, removed from office without congressional approval. This was a violation of the Tenure of Office Act. So Republicans in Congress brought up Johnson on charges of impeachment. And there was great pressure among Republicans to have Johnson removed from office, thinking that he was not a proper inheritor of the legacy of Abraham Lincoln and the presidency. Well, they fell one vote short from removing him. One of those who voted against having him removed of office was this guy here, Senator William Fessenden, a Bowdoin graduate from Maine. Back home in Maine, Chamberlain, as the Republican governor of his state, received pressure to try to force Fessenden to vote to have Johnson removed from office. He resisted that pressure. He supported what Fessenden did, despite the political winds that were blowing against him. So he displayed political courage at this time. In fact, so did Fessenden. I believe that JFK wrote about him in one of his profiles of courage in his famous book. And at Chamberlain's funeral many years later, the president of Bowdoin College, who gave a eulogy, actually mentioned this as a moment of courage in Chamberlain's life. So we think of the courage that Chamberlain displayed as being something that only took place on the battlefield, right? If I say Chamberlain and courage, many of us think of the backward slopes of Little Round Top on July 2nd. But he did display some courage in his convictions as a politician as well as a moderate Republican. Now in 1871, his term as governor, or his fourth term, I should say, as governor, came to a close. And conveniently enough, Bowdoin College is looking for a new president. So who better than the former governor of Maine, this Civil War hero, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain? So he would return to his alma mater, becoming the president of it. And as a former military man, Chamberlain's trying to bring about some reforms on campus, trying to introduce military drill for the students on campus. They're not really happy about this, so they actually revolt against him in 1874. He ends up getting them all to come back to the school, but the military drill is not mandatory anymore as he had tried to make it. And he deals with a number of other things. He tries to revamp the curriculum, adding in new things, believing that these young men need to be trained into good citizens in the instance that this nation needs them to defend it once again. Chamberlain also deals with a revolt in Maine, in the capital of Maine as a result of the 1880 election. Due to some vote tampering and fraud, there was a dispute over who would be the governor, and it almost came to violence. Chamberlain was asked to come to the capital and make sure that this did not result in a civil war within his state, something which he did. It was likened to another round top for him, another instance of military courage in his life. Ultimately, due to health problems, he had to resign from Bowdoin in 1883. His wound from Petersburg would afflict him for the rest of his life. He had continuous infections and several surgeries along the way as a result of this wound and the damage it did to his internal organs. So he had many surgeries throughout his years. This is a constant problem for him. But throughout these years, his pursuits as governor, his pursuits as an educator, his pursuits as a businessman, he is still talking frequently about the Civil War and its legacy. And I want to share some of those quotes with you today. In 1884, the year after he left Bowdoin College, he gave an address on Memorial Day where he said, "The reasons of our going into the war may not be the very reasons of the war itself. I do not think that many went into the war with the motive, distinctly and directly, to overthrow slavery by force of arms." So remember that quote. Remember that sentiment. Now, when Chamberlain was not in Maine, he did travel quite a bit. He went to Europe many times. He traveled throughout the United States. But as you might imagine, his favorite place to visit was Gettysburg. And he came back here many different times. He had a role in veterans organizations. He spoke at many different veterans events. He became the Maine department commander of the GAR. He was involved in the Maine Military Order of the Loyal Legion Commandery. And at the Gettysburg reunion in 1888, he was elected the president of the Society of the Army of the Potomac, an office which he claimed he was not seeking. And in 1889, in October, he came to Gettysburg to dedicate the monument to the 20th Maine, a monument that had been there since 1886. And this photo, I believe that's Chamberlain right there. Kind of hard to distinguish him, but that's him there. And he actually gave two speeches in 1889 in October when he was here. The first speech was at the Maine Monument location itself, but he gave a longer speech later that day where he placed an emphasis on the reasons why the war was fought. And this is something that I think we don't really grasp. A lot of these veterans, when they spoke of the reasons why the war was fought, they really stressed that this was for a Union. Certainly we know today that the war itself was caused first and foremost by the institution of slavery and its presence in the United States. But Chamberlain and other veterans, they're not speaking first and foremost about slavery. They're speaking about the national government. He said there was no war between the states. It was a war in the name of certain states to destroy the political existence of the United States. We fought against no state, but for its deliverance. We fought the enemies of our common country, to overthrow the engines and symbols of its destruction wherever found upon its soil. We fought no better, perhaps, than they. We exhibited perhaps no higher individual qualities, but the cause for which we fought was higher. Now, based on that, it's pretty clear what Chamberlain's saying here. It's not necessarily speaking about slavery, but he is acknowledging that, in his eyes at least, in the eyes of Union veterans, their cause was morally superior. Which leads questions to, what would Chamberlain say about the lost cause? This ideology that Confederates, such as Oates, as we will see, were espousing at that time, that their cause was actually the righteous one. Well, Chamberlain told us. The lost cause is not lost liberty and right of self-government. What is lost is slavery of men and supremacy of states. How many of you have ever heard the speech, "In great deeds something abides," or seen that quote before? Okay, a lot of heads nodding, a lot of hands going up. This is all in that same speech, folks. There's a lot of other good stuff in there too. Certainly we like that quote, "In great deeds something abides," because it lets us know that we can go to battlefields, and men such as Chamberlain thought that these were special places. But in these battlefield addresses, they are also contesting the issues over which this war was fought and the memory of the war. Chamberlain and Oates and others would use these speeches to try to put forward their memory of the war, essentially still fighting the battles over which, the causes over which the war was fought. Now, in Chamberlain's later years, his health problems grew greater and greater, although he still made many trips to Gettysburg as frequently as he could. He was Maine's representative on the committee to plan events for the 50th anniversary of the battle, and he came a few weeks before the 50th anniversary. He was not able to attend the 50th anniversary itself because of lingering problems with his war wounds, problems that ended up leading to a major infection in February of 1914 that took his life. And it's worth noting that this gentleman here, Abner Shaw, this physician of the 20th Maine who saved Chamberlain's life back at Petersburg in June of '64, guess what? He was there in February of 1914, still trying to save Chamberlain's life. So Chamberlain, he certainly did a lot. He spoke quite frequently on the issues of the war, trying to contest the memory of this great conflict. And we might say that for the rest of his life, everything he did was affected by what happened at Gettysburg. Because wherever he went, he was known as the hero of Little Round Top. This is something that colored the rest of his days. We might say he lived the rest of his days in the glow of his Gettysburg victory. So for a Union veteran of the war, this is something that very much impacted him in a positive way. It led to openings for him in politics and many other areas. It was not necessarily the case for William C. Oates. While Chamberlain lived in the glow of his Gettysburg victory, Oates would live in the shadow of his Gettysburg defeat. Another similarity is that each one of these officers had a brother with them at Gettysburg. Chamberlain had 2. Oates had 1, his younger brother, John Oates. Chamberlain didn't lose his brothers at Gettysburg. Oates did. So not only did Oates have to deal with the fact that he lost the battle here, the Confederacy lost the war, but he also lost his brother on this hillside here in south central Pennsylvania. And that's going to affect his memory of the war as well. Because of his amputation as a result of his Petersburg wound, Oates is going to be known as the one-armed hero of Henry County. And he's going to spend years working as a lawyer, just as he did before the war, in its aftermath. He's a loyal Democrat, but he disapproves of the violence that is beginning throughout the Reconstruction South, especially of the KKK and its rise. And he is supporting Democrats and their means of political victory, however possible. Reconstruction politics in Alabama, from what I've read in preparing for this program, certainly was not all above board. Many of these elections are going to be influenced by any means possible, stuffing ballot box, depriving the right to vote to whoever necessary. In 1880, Oates himself is elected to Congress, and he's going to serve as a representative in Congress for many years, gaining a place on the national political scene. He's opposing federal funds on public education and the federal regulation of many things throughout the South, but he's also voting on legislation for the creation of national military parks. Quite significant for us here at Gettysburg. Now, certainly he's not the perfect congressman. He was motivated by partisanship and personal drive, and as a veteran, he was inserting himself higher and higher in the world of Alabama politics. He was not afraid to play that card, if you will. One observer wrote of Oates during an 1894 race, which we'll talk about here in a moment, your valiant one-armed hero can work the veteran racket more adroitly and successfully than any follower of the stars and bars who shows a scar or empty sleeve as a passport to office. Now, just seeing all the political ads on TV today, I can tell that our political attacks and praises have changed a lot since the 1890s. Right. Now, in 1894, the Democratic Party in Alabama is going to run Oates as their nominee for the governorship. Now, at this time, there are movements by farmers throughout the South to try to get more political representation, try to deal with these economic issues that are afflicting states such as Alabama. They want more currency inflation. They want more money in their pockets. Oates is against this. So he is going to run against a man by the name of Reuben Cobb here in the 1894 gubernatorial election, which was, from, again, what I've read, one of the most corrupt elections in Alabama state history. Each side is doing everything they can, playing every card they have to try to win the governor's race. Oates ultimately won. He was elected governor in August of 1894. He won by about 30,000 votes. Now, Reuben Cobb here was not happy with that. So on December 1st of 1894, when Oates was inaugurated the governor of the state of Alabama, Cobb decided he was going to have his own inauguration. He was sworn in. He gave an inaugural address. He had his own parade down the street. Nothing ever came of it, of course, but that's just one thing I found when researching this program that really, really struck me. And this guy just didn't want to accept the fact that he lost the governor's race to Oates. So, to each his own, I guess, right? Well, Oates' term as governor is going to come amidst some very tumultuous times in Alabama politics. The state has changing political rules. The state is in a difficult financial state, a changing economy, changes in race relations, and Oates is inserted right in the midst of all of this at a very tumultuous time in his state's history. He had pledged only to serve one term, and he ended up only serving one term, though he did try to win the 1896 nomination. So in his 2 years as governor, Oates is not really going to succeed in accomplishing many of his priorities. He called for reform of convict labor lease programs. He called to outlaw concealed weapons. He called for an increase in the governor's salary. That's not really that surprising why a governor would want that. Also called for tax reform. He's not really accomplishing a whole lot of these things. But as governor, he is speaking on issues that relate directly to the Civil War and to Civil War veterans as well. He's trying to take care of veterans from Alabama. He asked the legislature to authorize the placement of monuments on Civil War battlefields. Okay, that's something significant that he's going to keep fighting on. He's also speaking out on actions that he's calling to be taken to prevent lynching going on in the state of Alabama. Racial violence is rising rapidly and alarmingly in Oates' eyes. He's certainly not an egalitarian. He's certainly not for desegregation. But he is calling for ways to try to stop this racial violence occurring in the South. Now, after he leaves, well, hold on, I think we have another slide first. Right, sorry, getting ahead of myself. While he is governor, he's also giving a very important speech on a Civil War battlefield. It is not here at Gettysburg, it's to our south in Georgia. It is at the dedication of Chickamauga and Chattanooga. In 1895, he is one speaking there at the dedication of that battlefield. This is an early picture of a visitor at Chickamauga. He's giving a speech representing those portions of the Army of Northern Virginia that fought at that great and climactic battle in Georgia in September of 1863. Now, many of the speeches that were given there at Chickamauga that day by veterans, they had a lot of good feelings to them. nobody was really trying to rattle the cage that much, except for William Oates. William Oates is making some pretty interesting statements in this speech, such as this one here. Every well-informed person knows that the agitation of the slavery question was the immediate and provoking cause of secession. That's a Confederate veteran saying that. The presence in our midst of the African race for which they are in no way responsible has ever been the Pandora's box of our American politics. So we think in his speech, Oates is saying, all right, well, the war was about slavery, right? Well, no. He is saying that it was the abuses by Northern politicians over this institution which left Southern states no choice but to secede to defend their own rights. He's calling Abraham Lincoln a tyrannical abolitionist in this speech. At some points, Union veterans are actually getting up and booing him off the stage. Hopefully the talk today doesn't get to that point. It has been asserted by some of the distinguished speakers here who served in the Union Army that the abolition of slavery was one of the grand objects for which the war was waged. It was not for slavery as such, but for the majority of our men never owned a slave. Now remember earlier I told you to remember that quote from Chamberlain in 1884, where Chamberlain said the war was not, or many Union soldiers did not enlist with that first and foremost in their minds. This was something that jumped out at me. These two officers, about 11 years apart, are saying the same thing about why many of these soldiers are serving in the war. Of course, they're disagreeing on the rest of it. Oates continues, we fought for the right of our states to regulate and govern their own affairs free from the dictation of others. We fought for the right as God gave us to see the right. Echoes of Lincoln's second inaugural there, though a much different message to it, as God gave us to see the right. So Oates is using this speech as a partisan moment, and it was treated as such. He got pretty negative reviews. Many veterans treated him quite harshly as a result of it. But this is something that he is going to continue with in many of his speeches. He's continuing to fight for the memory of the South. But he is going to find his way in the service of the United States government again. During the Spanish-American War, he becomes a brigadier general, and he's stationed at Camp Meade here in Pennsylvania. And while he is there, he will bring his wife and his son here to Gettysburg to show them where he fought on this battlefield. Now, when he brings them here, he sees, hey, there's this nice shiny new monument to the 20th Maine here on Little Round Top. Wouldn't it be nice if I could have a monument for my soldiers there too? Now, Oates never leaves the country. He never sees combat in the Spanish-American War, but he is very proud that he served in that conflict. He would say, I am now a Yankee general, formerly a rebel colonel, and right each time. Oates certainly had a way with words. But another very interesting chapter in his political story comes in 1901, when the state of Alabama is debating a new constitution. And a big issue here is who is going to have the right to vote. And by this I mean not just African Americans. Efforts are underway to deny the franchise to poor whites as well, because many of those poor whites are farmers who would like to see currency inflation. They would like to get away from the gold standard. That is something that the Democratic Party of Alabama is not ready to do. So they're having this state constitutional convention to determine these issues. And Oates is a delegate to this convention. And as such, he's going to make some very interesting stands politically. He's going to oppose clauses such as the grandfather clause, something that stipulated that only those whose grandfathers had voted prior to 1867 could vote. Obviously, that's really restricting the pie there. The convention president noted that at the convention it was necessary for Southerners, quote, to establish white supremacy in this state. Oates will also oppose the Descendants Clause, which exempted Confederate veterans and their descendants from the strict voting requirements set up for everyone else. He will speak out against these things, noting that it's not right to have violence towards African Americans. It's not right to limit their vote if they are capable of doing so, according to his arguments. Now, certainly he's far from an egalitarian. He's still speaking about how they needed to have segregation in the South. But we can see 4 decades after the war has come to a close, Oates is one of those in the South who are beginning to question how they allocate the right to vote. Ultimately, Oates lost on all these battles. These clauses were in the new state constitution, which he did vote for. So Oates is playing an interesting role as a voice of dissent in the 1901 Constitutional Convention in Alabama. After that, his political career is largely at an end. He really doesn't have any more influence on Alabama politics. Instead, he's going to turn his attention to the memory of the war and reunions, such as this one here in 1902. He has fought his battles politically. At the state constitutional convention, he didn't win those battles. He won the governor's race, but he didn't really do a whole lot. He didn't accomplish a lot of his objectives there. So we can say while he sought success in this political arena, he didn't really find it. So instead, he would still seek success in an arena that was much closer to his heart, a fight for memory. What we might term the Second Battle of Little Round Top. As I noted before, he saw this nice monument to the 20th Maine and he thought, hey, wouldn't it be great if we had a monument to the 15th Alabama there too? So Oates will begin lobbying the commissioners of the park in its early years to place a monument to the 15th Alabama on the site where they fought valiantly in 1863. He sees this monument, he wants his own. He sees this flank marker, he wants a flank marker too. He submits plans for a monument and flank markers to the commissioners. In fact, this is the map he sent. He has the different positions of the 15th Alabama on here. We can see, of course, where the markers for the 20th Maine are located. Got the first attack of the 15th Alabama, second, third, fourth. He's got them a lot further than Chamberlain ever did. Chamberlain would never acknowledge this, and we'll get to that in a minute. But this is the boulder. Oates wants his monument near this boulder, saying, we pushed their left flank back, we pushed their right flank back, we deserve a monument up there. He even submits text to go on that monument. Now, this is Oates writing this text, so look how it starts. He lost his brother there, folks. He wants something with his brother's name on it. He wants the actions of his regiment, the sacrifices of his regiment, to be acknowledged up there. Now, he's going to have a very difficult time getting that done. Pictured here, William Robbins is the southern representative on for the commissioners running the park at that time. And he would converse with Robbins quite a bit on whether or not he would be able to have his monument placed up there. At one point, Robbins had said, well, yeah, we'll see if we can do it. Robbins himself actually tried to price out some stone to put the monument up on the Little Round Top. But ultimately, the commissioners decided that they were going to enforce the battle line rule, meaning that his monument would have to be placed where they started the day. Well, that's not Little Round Top, right? That's quite a ways away from Little Round Top. Oates says, no, we don't want our monument over on Warfield Ridge. That's not where my brother died. My brother died up on Little Round Top. He will write to the Secretary of War. No success. He writes to the commissioners. No success. John Nicholson, one of the commissioners, is going to send along some of Oates' correspondence to an officer named Joshua Chamberlain. Then Colonel Chamberlain, can you verify these statements that Colonel Oates is making? Can you tell us whether or not this is true? And this is Chamberlain's response. I should feel no objection to the erection of a monument to the honor of a regiment that had pushed its way so far around the flank of the Union line and made so gallant an attack. But I should expect it to be placed on ground where it actually stood at some time during the battle, at the extreme point of its advance if desired, so that it might not only represent the valor of a regiment but the truth of its history. You think Chamberlain wants a monument to the 15th Alabama behind his? What does that say? If you're on Little Round Top today and you see the 20th Maine monument and then you turn around and see a monument to the Alabama soldiers, it says one of them's out of place, right? With this, Oates is never going to succeed. With Chamberlain saying this was not the correct position, Oates is never going to get his monument on Little Round Top. He actually wrote to Chamberlain himself trying to settle this issue. The two of them never met after the war. The only time they were ever in the same place was on Little Round Top during the battle, and they never met face to face there. But he wrote to Chamberlain in 1905 trying to see if Chamberlain could maybe soften his stance or maybe they could come to an agreement. it never came about. Chamberlain told him the same thing he told the commissioners. Hey, I don't have a problem with you putting a monument there. I just want to make sure it's in the right place. So this is a battle that Oates fought unsuccessfully for many years. I mean, this is 1905. This is many, many years after the war. So we could term this the Second Battle of Little Round Top. Oates was frustrated by this for the rest of his life. Once again, he had lost to Chamberlain in a fight for ground on Little Round Top. And Oates was not the only officer to bring Chamberlain's recollections of the war into question. Ellis Speer and Oliver Norton also questioned Chamberlain's telling of the story of Little Round Top, something which, as time went on, became more and more resolute. Speer became greatly frustrated once Chamberlain passed away, and after Chamberlain died would write some critical things of him. It should be noted that in one of Oates' first visits to the Gettysburg battlefield, he met up with one of these men, Speer, on the ground on Little Round Top, and they spent several hours walking the ground together. So Oates never met Chamberlain face-to-face, but he did meet Ellis Speer face-to-face to discuss the events of the battle. And again, it's not my purpose today to refight the Battle of Little Round Top, just to let you know that Oates, this is something that is near and dear to his heart. And for the rest of his life, even into the 20th century, he is still fighting these battles. He called on the Alabama state legislature to send resolutions asking that a monument to his soldiers be placed on Little Round Top. He is doing everything he can, unsuccessfully though. One thing that is also dear and near to his heart is searching for his brother John's grave. John was not killed outright on July 2nd, 1863. He was mortally wounded. He was hit numerous times, left for dead on Little Round Top. He ended up dying a few weeks after the battle. Every year, there were 2 days that Oates could not stand to bear. Those days were July 2nd and December 24th. December 24th was his brother's birthday. Every year, he became morose, depressed on those days because they reminded him of this. And they reminded him that he didn't know where his brother was buried. Well, in 1908, Oates is appointed commissioner of a new commission that is charged with locating and marking Confederate graves in Northern Territory. Well, this is an opportunity for him, right? So he's going to reach out to some of those who were involved with burying the Confederate dead on this battlefield, and those who were involved with removing those dead from this battlefield to Southern cemeteries. Specifically, he writes to John O'Neill, Dr. John O'Neill, and Dr. Rufus Weaver, asking them if any of their records of Confederate dead here at Gettysburg spoke of his brother. And he learns that yes, they did have a verified grave for his brother. His brother died, was buried on the Thistle Farm, and in 1874 was relocated to Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond. Now Oates gets this and he's thinking, all right, I finally have a grave I can visit for my brother. Only to learn that the place where his brother was interred at the Hollywood Cemetery, it's simply a large grave with many different Confederate dead from Gettysburg. So he knew that his brother was buried at Hollywood. He knew that that part of the cemetery was cared for, but he never had a specific stone to go and visit. And that would bother him for the remainder of his days. This is where his brother was, Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond. This all happened near the end of Oates' life. He passed away September 9th, 1910. This is his grave in Alabama. And he has largely slipped from memory in the years since his passing. Unlike Chamberlain, he did not have different books devoted to his life and story. It is only really with the ascendancy of Chamberlain in recent years that we know who Oates is. Otherwise, he would be one of these many Confederate soldiers who slipped into obscurity after the Civil War. But Chamberlain and Oates had many different similarities throughout their lives. They were very different men, differing backgrounds, differing temperaments. Chamberlain was studying theology and classical languages. Oates was running away from home because he thought he killed a guy in a fight. Oates was a lawyer in Alabama, a Democratic politician in favor of secession. Chamberlain's a professor at Bowdoin College. So they're very different individuals. They lived vastly different lives. But their lives were forever changed and impacted by what happened here at Gettysburg. They shared the experience of battle at Little Round Top. And it came to characterize the rest of their lives. War was the great equalizer for them. War brought them together. Though they didn't agree on its causes or on the placement of monuments, they were more similar than either of them would have realized. Each was severely wounded at Petersburg. Each sought fulfillment in politics after the war. Each man became governor of his respective state. Neither was as successful as governor as he was during the war. Each was known primarily for his military career for the rest of his life. Each gave speeches, wrote books about the war. Each tried to shape the memory of the war, especially regarding his own role in it. Despite their achievements in war and politics, Chamberlain and Oates were common veterans in this regard. And this is something that I think is lost when we think of Gettysburg, especially when we think of this grand scene on Little Round Top. We think of Chamberlain as Jeff Daniels giving these passionate speeches, saving the Union valiantly. But we forget that these were ordinary guys. These were common veterans in many different ways. The events of this battle lingered with them. They spent the rest of their lives searching for meaning, just as hundreds of thousands other veterans did. When we look past the movies and the myths, we see them for who they really were. And I think in some regard we can tie this into, for those who are here with us this morning, our discussion regarding the book Confederates in the Attic with author Tony Horwitz. His book highlights the ways that Americans remember the Civil War today. And one thing that is abundantly clear from it is that we don't agree on much regarding the war today. Chamberlain and Oates did not agree on much regarding the war. But we are all still bound together because of that war. We might not agree why the war was fought. We might still have debates over this, but we all agree that the Civil War was this major event that in many ways created the country we live in now. I think Oates and Chamberlain would agree that they might not understand the views of the other one in regards to why the war was fought, but they each would understand the impact that the war had on the other one as a veteran. Because for the rest of their lives, these two men were impacted by it. Chamberlain living in the glow of his Gettysburg glory, Oates in the shadow of his Gettysburg defeat. So the next time we see this quote that Chamberlain spoke here at Gettysburg in 1889, "In great deeds something abides, on great fields something stays. Forms change and pass, bodies disappear, but spirits linger to consecrate ground for the vision place of souls." Remember that he's not just speaking about how something stays on this battlefield for us to remember today and in the grand actions. He's also talking about how for veterans themselves, something remained here on this field and its impact on their lives. I want to thank you folks for coming out today for our lecture. I think we do have some time for questions.